This is Eat, Sleep, Invest, the marketing podcast for real estate investors to get more deals.
Most of the times in commercial, we're looking at square foot, right? But with industrial, you guys are looking at cubic footage, right?
It's definitely trending that way, and that is becoming a hot topic. There's a survey that was actually just put out, and it was surveying all the companies that occupy warehouse space, and they said that was the number one thing that they're looking for right now is ceiling height. And for the exact reason that you said is now you're looking at it from a cubic footage standpoint, where if you only had a building with 20-foot ceilings and you compared it to one with 40-foot ceilings, if you could stack that much extra space because you have higher ceiling heights, now all of a sudden you're taking advantage of the same footprint of the building, but you're utilizing that much more. So it definitely is trending towards cubic footage being more important. But I think right now we still talk square footage day to day. Like that's still the number one thing that I'm always talking about is what's the rent per square foot? How much square foot is the building? How much square feet is the land? Square footage is still probably the driving metric, but cubic footage is becoming increasingly more important.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, especially for people just getting into the space, because you'd think, okay, I'm going to go buy a warehouse. And then depending on the height of the ceilings, things like that, that could dictate whoever can rent from you, things like that. And I heard you talking somewhere else too about the construction type can dictate some different things too with like the posts, things like that. Why don't you talk a little bit on that side?
Yeah, there's a few things we could discuss on there. So you could look at the building envelope itself. So whether the building was manufactured out of precast concrete or whether it's steel. Precast concrete is going to have a lot longer of a lifespan. It generally looks better than that corrugated steel panel, but the steel is a lot cheaper to put up as well. So there's always an inherent trade-off between quality and cost. Probably one that's driving the conversation more right now than even the envelope would be how the interior is set up. And by that, I just mean like the columns. So you could appreciate a warehouse in some scenarios can be 200 feet long, can be 100 feet wide. You need to have the foundational support in there to keep the roof up there. So quite often that'll mean that there's columns throughout. And that column grid or column spacing is important for companies that need to utilize that space because there's physical impediments inside that warehouse space now. Like those columns are in the way of things happening. So depending on how close those columns are, the column spacing, that can be a pretty big influence. Some buildings will even be built, what's the terminology most often uses, clear span. So that's where it's actually built with no interior columns. But again, there's that trade-off between cost and the value that it's providing. Ideally, nobody wants columns. The columns aren't helping anything. They're structural. They need to be there. But it's also a lot less expensive to build with columns versus doing that clear span. So that all factors into how a company is looking at these spaces. And equally as important, I think an investor needs to be cognizant of this as well, because if they are buying a building, and this is where I think industrial is unique in the standpoint that one oversight or one mistake can be very costly for an investor. Because if you buy a property and let's say it has 18-foot ceiling heights, just using an arbitrary number, and you didn't realize that all the competition has 30-foot ceiling heights, you're now at a clear disadvantage for what the competition is. And that might mean having to lease it at a much lower lease rate. That might mean that there's not even tenants that are interested in it. So knowing all these important characteristics of a warehouse are really important to mitigate any downside risk that you have.